Hello, everyone, and welcome to Strategic Affairs with Mark Chandler. I'm Mark, and I want to thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you go back to episode one, where we talked about what we're going to cover in Strategic Affairs with Mark Chandler, I mentioned that you may get any one combination of marks in that episode. You could get that Marine mark, you could get that Alabama mark. Well, today, unfortunately, you're going to get Professor Mark as we go over this important topic out there. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to make your head hurt too bad in this episode, but I do think that you're going to gain some information and valuable insight into what makes nations tick and what gives them their power behind things. So, before we get into elements of national power, just as a reminder for our overall objective is to inform you of current events around the world and their potential impact to the United States on us today, tomorrow, or the day after, and our security and our way of life, right? Sometimes we will dip into domestic issues out there. Today's episode actually touches on some of our domestic strength and weaknesses out there. I'm always going to use my tried and true intelligence analytic processes to bring you an unbiased, fact-based assessment and impact as we look at these events. Now, our approach is to provide that assessment for you going forward, so to create a little bit more comprehension out of the complex way of life. So, as Professor Mark would say, let's break out the notepads and get started. And this episode is about understanding the elements of national power. Now, this has been around for decades. I would say you could go back throughout the complete history of nation states and compare nation states when I look at these elements of national power. What do we call it? We call it DIME. Now, if you recall, I'm from the government and I'm here to help, but the government never saw an acronym it didn't like. So DIME, D-I-M-E, stands for diplomatic, information, military, and economic. And that is a way to evaluate a nation's relative strength and its strength compared to other nations. If you were to take each of these elements and look at how a country performs or is successful in one of them, you can then see how its strength is to itself, but also relative to a nation that is in competition with. But what do we mean by diplomacy? Well, that's how a nation states engages with other nations and the international organizations. For the United States, that's led by our president and employed through the State Department out there. When we talk about diplomacy, we're talking about negotiations, how well we negotiate, how strong we negotiate, how strong our alliances are. Can we develop new partnerships out there with the intent that is always to support our national interest and our national values? How well a nation does in international diplomacy and the alliances and the strength of those alliances helps create a stronger diplomatic element of national power. When we talk about information, remember, information is power, right? How well a nation can collect and receive and disseminate information is critical for its national security and its domestic awareness and domestic security. This information is illustrated through public diplomacy, media strategies, keeping the population informed and allowing the population to inform itself and inform one another and communicate. It's also embodied by how well we do intelligence operations and collections against our foreign adversaries. Can we gain that information that we need? So we want to be able to influence domestic audiences. We want to influence foreign adversaries. We want to keep our people, our population informed with the right information, the free flow of information. And here I want to bring up a little bit of something. In America, we have the First Amendment. We have a free flow of information. You can go out on just about any social media platform and find a free expression out there. And that's what keeps America great, this free exchange of information, right? I would say in that regard, we have a positive flow of information. We have a strong information element of power. But there's something just as dangerous out there, and it's exercised very well by authoritarian Marxist, socialist, and communist regimes such as Russia, China, Iran, Cuba. They're leading examples of information control. They control the type of information their population receives. They control the amount of information. They control the free exchange of information among their populace. So when I look at that, while we consider those bad ways to process information and share information, those countries are excellent practitioners at manipulating the information sphere. So while we consider that bad, we have to realize how well they do it and how that plays into a larger perspective of information warfare and information environment around the world. We now need to look at the military. The military should be self explanatory. It's pretty straightforward. This is a country's true military capabilities. For the United States, that's exercised through our Department of War and each of the branches of the military. We, when we look at this, we look at the numbers of military forces. We can look at the types of military forces you have, the technology that those military forces, we look at their ability to integrate with one another across what we in America call the joint spectrum of conflict. So when we're looking at that, we want to see how well they fight. You can have a large military force with a poor capability, poor leadership, poor training, as we see primarily illustrated by Russia's failures in the Ukraine war. That vast military really hasn't been able to make many gains after the initial invasion. Or you can see the successes that the United States has had, with a somewhat smaller military, where we could be falling behind, however. So you have to look and look at all the relative strength of that. I would argue right now that across the whole military spectrum, the United States probably has the advantage. But that's across the entire spectrum. That's not across just the numbers. And we'll get into that in later episodes. Let's move on to economics. When I talk about economics, that's critical. That impacts you every day. So when I'm starting to talk about this, what is a nation's economic power? What are its strengths out there? How reliant on trading partners is it? How secure is the supply chain? As we found out during COVID, the United States supply chain was very vulnerable to overseas weaknesses and shortages. So you have to take and encompass the entire atmosphere of the economics and look at economics as both the opportunities that it creates for advancement and success and a positive way of life for its own population versus what another adversary might try to do to negatively impact our economic well-being. So we can use economics as a lever as long as we're focused on gaining and maintaining our economic advantage for the betterment of our people. Other nations are doing the same thing. So you can look at how economics starts to play in struggle for supremacy around the globe or between two nations. But you have to look at economic as relative to all the other elements of national power. Now, as I said, dime is tried and true. It's been around for decades, and I would argue that you could probably go back in history and reevaluate some interactions between the ancient nation states or other times in history where you can compare those relative powers. But I need to change dime. I need to change dime to timed, TIMED. And what I'm doing is I'm inserting technology. In today's society, technology is a game changer. Technology advances so fast right now that nations are competing to have a technological edge, whether it's in the military, whether it's in computing power, whether it's in our ability to communicate and protect our communications. Technology is fast moving, and one of the biggest places of competition right now that we have to look at. So I'm just taking dime, I'm adding time, and I'm turning it around. But what you need to look at when we incorporate technology is how it fits in to so many of those other elements of national power. We can see where technology can positively or negatively impact economics. We know our modern weapon systems are getting more technologically advanced. So we have to maintain that technological edge. So when I look at this and when you incorporate all the elements of national power, I think you can give that as a backdrop for how you're seeing any kind of challenges that the United States faces or any struggles between two nation states. It's not necessarily a predictor of what the outcome's going to be, but it can show you weaknesses and it can allow you an opportunity to see where we can take action for the betterment of our national security before somebody takes action to undercut that. Again, I want to thank you for listening to today's podcast. Elements of national power. I know it sounded kind of dry, and Professor Chandler did lecture you a little bit, but hopefully you have a better understanding of the interaction. As a reminder, you can tune in to us on Spotify. You can watch more of our podcasts on YouTube. If you're curious about world affairs, please reach out to our staff at CASIL, CASIL, Chandler Associates for Strategy, Intelligence, and Leadership. Look at our webpage at markchandler.com or for more in-depth reports. If you want to reach out to us, please write us at markchandler.castle@gmail.com to see the different services that we offer. Thank you and have a great day.